Since 4722 Huangdi happened to be the year of the Wood Dragon, I thought it would be fun to spend the last 11 months buckling down and playing as many different dragon games that I could get my hands on cheaply, and I managed to play through a lot of them. It was great, and I was able to explore a broad collection of franchises I've never touched before and deepen my appreciations of ones that I had. I'll absolutely never do anything like this again, but I'm glad I did it once. Kicking the year off with Dragon Quest made me see the ghost of Yuji Horii greatest work in almost everything that I played after, especially as my mind drifted to the announced HD 2D remakes of the Erdrick trilogy. Dragon Quest III added a new job as well as an associated monster taming system on top of the other changes to the job system that they implemented. It isn't just a gussied up port like the Final Fantasy Pixel remasters, but an extra featured modernization. I think that's great, but I'm not confident that would work for the original Dragon Quest. Something that I actually think works in the first game's favor is how relatively short it is. The core of the game is about managing your resources to ensure that you have enough health to get you to the next town or dungeon, but a big part of that inevitably includes a lot of classic JRPG style grinding. For a big 80-hour epic that could feel like a slog, but Dragon Quest can be beat in a leisurely weekend. Couple that with the quick pace of combat, the game doesn't overstay its welcome in spite of its delightful simplicity. The more you add to Dragon Quest beyond the purely aesthetic, the more you risk poisoning the experience with extra tedium. I could be overthinking this, especially since the additions to Dragon Quest III are entirely optional, but a question still lingered in the back of my mind. How would you remake the original Dragon Quest? Now, when I first asked myself this question, Enix hadn't announced the HD 2D remakes of the first two games, nor that they would be bundled together. A production strategy that is, upon reflection, brilliantly perfect. It provides just enough content before any of the new additions to satisfy JRPG fans willing to pay full MSRP, and it avoids the production's biggest challenge, standing out amongst all the other Dragon Quest I remakes made by the rest of the game industry over the years. I know this sounds absurd, but I think it makes sense if we start to break it down. The original Dragon Quest is a hybrid first and third person, open world, fantasy role playing game where you control a single character in turn based combat and real time exploration. Its plot isn't incredibly complex, relying on a straightforward structure where you play as the hero on a noble quest to save the kingdom from an evil dragon lord. NPC dialogue is the main way the story is communicated, and these conversations not only provide narrative context, but also give potential hints to solve certain encounters or find potential side quests. The world itself is vast, with almost no barriers, a delightful openness that also obscures its dangers. Cross an unassuming bridge before you're ready, and suddenly the slimes are orange and killing you in 2 shots. All of this is in service of fostering a sense of heroic adventure with the player at the center. Anecdotally speaking, I've seen people complain that the Dragon Quest franchise doesn't actually hit its vibe until the second game because of the original's focus on controlling a single character. It's an understandable complaint given the expectations built up over the years of Japanese role-playing games focusing on a party of misfits saving the world, but I think it fails to appreciate how that expectation is the result of choices that could have been taken the genre down a very different path. It's entirely possible for JRPGs to have developed in a way that prioritized lone heroes over a growing fellowship while still emphasizing a sense of epic adventure, and it's not even hard to imagine what this evolution would look like. We saw it in 1995's Elder Scrolls Arena, and 2002's Gothic, and 2011's Dragon's Dogma, and 2022's Elden Ring. In a way, the entire game industry has been remaking the original Dragon Quest for years, and that's super cool. I'm increasingly suspicious of the universality of dragons. It's a beautifully romantic idea that feels a bit oversold because it stresses the intuitive similarities of mythical reptiles in a way that we don't really see with other myths. Take the chimera, for example. While it's sometimes used as a catch-all phrase for mythical creatures amalgamated from different animal parts, we don't really try to flatten the uniqueness of Egyptian sphinxes, Persian manticores, and Greek griffins by stressing the chimeric supercategory. Hell, games will often treat these monsters as different creature families altogether, while also having a huge box labeled dragon with every flavor of big lizard. But my suspicion isn't going to stop this particular romantic universality from being the reason why I'm excited to check out all the different dragon designs across the medium. I was genuinely curious what, if any, creative differences dragons would have across games and franchises, or if I would notice any trends. And ultimately, only one thing really stood out to me. If a game needs less than a dozen or so dragons, most developers are satisfied with palette swaps and greebling for differentiation. So unless you have a real need for a variety of designs like Pokemon, Monster Hunter, or Dragon Spirits, developers would usually make their dragons look like either Alduin or Gregory and deploy a Power Rangers palette of different colors as needed. Unless, of course, your Legend of Dragoon. I'm incredibly impressed by Sony's criminally neglected JRPG franchise. It's a fascinating departure from the action-adventure games that would eventually come to dominate their output, and even still, the cinematic flair that would be modern Sony's signature is present in Legend of Dragoon. Boss fights would have a magnificent spectacle to them for the time, with attacks worthy of their impact, and it's still fun to watch them play out today. It's also panic-inducing when the attacks eat half, but I'm most impressed by the bonkers creativity in their dragon designs. Rather than another legally distinct silhouette pulled directly from a D&D monster manual, Legend of Dragoon emphasizes their role as powerful bioweapons wielded against the tyrannical Winglies. To that end, the traditional design is jettisoned in favor of a mashup of H.R. Geiger, regular animals, and military hardware. You have an armadillo tank dropping on top of enemies from orbit, an alien version of Mega Metagross 13 years before the 3rd gen Pokemon remakes, and a 7-winged dragonfly with magic missile launchers and a Yamato cannon. It's a creative decision that emphasizes mythical power over the other classical dragon traits of cunning or greed without reducing them to violent animals, which stands apart from so many other dragon adaptations. I've always been partial to fictional histories and taxonomies like Douglas Steer's Dragonology because the best of them expertly weave a beautiful tapestry of a fantastical world. However, their need to ground their histories in the common telling of myth and fairy tales means that they're often anchored to predictably familiar representations. If you've read any D&D monster manual, then you've also happened to read Dragonology or Fantastic Beasts and Where to Find Them. In contrast, Legend of Dragoon pushes against the horizon while confidently claiming that an intercontinental ballistic missile can be a dragon, and I absolutely love it. I found it incredibly funny that when I told people I was going to be checking out Dragon Age, they all told me not to play Origins, even though they were all admitted to being huge fans of the franchise, and some of them even had Origins as their favorite in the series. They mostly had concerns about the old gameplay and writing feeling dated, but I had played Divinity Dragon Commander recently, and I absolutely loved it in spite of it being one of the worst RTS games I've played since Force Commander. A 2009 CRPG's dated sensibilities isn't going to give me pause. What did give me pause was that the first page of guides on the Steam page was completely filled with the same bug-fixing instructions in different languages, and a single guide on how to speedrun getting cucked by Alistair. The bug fix required using a third-party tool to allow the game to properly utilize RAM on 64-bit machines, and since this was before GOG patched in their fix, I felt that the hassle of wrangling this tool to play nice with Origin was more of a pain than it was worth. So I played the original Dragon Age through Xbox 360 backwards compatibility on Game Pass. For context, a lot of people I talked to thought that this was the worst way to play the game. Not only is it missing all of the DLC that often provided additional context and quality of life features, but it also has a far more constrained control scheme and camera zoom. In spite of this, I absolutely adored the game. I may not have taken it as seriously as the creators intended, but I was charmed by the walking HR violations your party members happened to be, and had a wonderful time. What I found most interesting about Origins, however, was how it compared to the game I played right after, Final Fantasy XVI. Both games happen to use the oppression of magically gifted individuals as a load-bearing theme, but ironically have opposite successes and failures in their execution. Dragon Age leverages these tropes for rock-solid world-building. Mages are in turn in a combination of Hogwarts and Campamachi because of the perceived threat magical ability possesses to both the mage and the people around them. The game is peppered with anecdotes of tragic magical onsets destroying property or hurting people. The opening cinematic places the blame of the blight you fight throughout the game squarely on mages, and you're explicitly warned that mages are uniquely susceptible to demonic possession. All of these details and more provide clear context and motivations for people's attitudes and behavior towards mages in the world. Where I think Dragon Age stumbles is an uncertainty of concept. Much of the text is clearly sympathetic to the mages, highlighting the unfair and capricious treatment that they receive entirely because of the misfortune of their birth. However, every criminal suspicion the Chantry holds over the spiritual vulnerability and physical dangers mages pose are confirmed in every quest where those suspicions play a role. It is possible to project a self-fulfilling prophecy subtext onto all of this, but the supernatural elements of Dragon Age interfere with this reading because of magic's claimed ontological impact on the caster. It's incredibly messy to the point of making X-Men comics look scholarly. On the flip side, Final Fantasy XVI has a clarity of purpose that even a child can understand. It loudly and consistently condemns the economic exploitation and oppression of mages. Even when its characters grapple with the political and economic ramifications of their actions, the text strongly endorses their crusade to eradicate wizard chattel slavery. They fully recognize the apocalyptic change they're going to force in the world, but fully commit to it anyways, not only because the fate of the world is at stake, but also because everyone deserves to live a dignified and free life. There is a charisma to this execution that is undeniable, until you scrutinize FF16's world building. Unfortunately, the game will frequently invite this scrutiny because it'll often fail to provide social or historical context for motivations. For example, a scene early in the game has the heroes overhear a conversation a woman is having with her friends. The friends open the conversation with congratulating the woman for her new baby and inquiring to its whereabouts. The woman expresses frustration about learning that the child was a mage, and relief that she was able to condemn the baby to a life of slavery by surrendering them to the local garrison. The purpose of this scene is straightforward and meant to communicate the prejudice against the magically inclined that we previously only saw in the nobility runs broadly across the peasantry as well. But I can't help asking myself, yo, why are they like this? Mages aren't described as being a danger to themselves or others, so what caused this hyper-psychopath attitude that a new mother wouldn't bat an eye at abandoning her child because it can cast Asuna? But that then leads to other questions like, why are icons and their dominants treated with reverence even though they're just super powerful mages? Why isn't a dominant granting the ability to use magic seen as incredibly taboo? Why are only mages enslaved? If a crystal is just as good or even better at channeling magic as a mage, then any regular slave with the crystal will be just as good as a mage as well. Why do the different kingdoms look like they're from the Game of Thrones rather than magically dependent societies that run on crystal or magical slavery? If magical chattel slavery is such a core pillar of the economy, why don't the tools and infrastructure look like it's built to maximally exploit these people? Now, to be fair, Final Fantasy XVI does eventually provide answers to many of these questions, but they come right before the end of the game in a codex entry that you cannot unlock beforehand. By that time, I had been pulling on this thread for so long that I could reach the moon. And it really does boil down to timing here. Would some of the other world-building issues go away if 16 was as upfront about the causes of magical oppression as Dragon Age? No. Its economy would still be in shambles, but I would have had enough motivational context to understand why the world works the way it does, and how that reinforces its themes. The two games coexist with fascinating contrasts, and I feel like they are in tight dialogue with each other even though they were released over a decade apart. Final Fantasy is a slick, real-time action game with tight controls and a clear messaging on many of its same themes. It's easy to recommend based on its accessibility and presentation alone, but ironically, it's the old, clunky, and thematically messy game everyone told me not to play that I'm more excited to revisit. And Dragon Age isn't even the only franchise I'm excited to revisit from this year. But I gave myself the arbitrary deadline of the Lunar New Year to get this video out, so I didn't have time to talk about the fascinating intrusiveness of Like a Dragon Ishin's tiny open world, or my toddler-esque reaction to how tightly Dragon Quest Builder 2 holds your hand in its 80-hour tutorial, or even write proper reviews for any of the games I've already mentioned. But I have no regrets, because I got to fill my year with dragons. Thanks for watching.